to everyone to this seminar and webinar. It is 1:15 now, but we'll just wait a couple of minutes more while people settle in before we actually start. We start young. Shall we start? Welcome once more. Welcome to everyone here in the room and across various time zones to this Agrarian Change Seminar in this room and webinar globally, organized by the Journal Agrarian Change and the Department of Development Studies at SOAS University of London. I'm Jens Lerche from SOAS, and I'll be chairing this session. I'm also joined by two co-organizers, Shreya Sinha from University of Reading and Mihika Chatterjee here from SOAS. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Mihika Chatterjee of the University of Oxford as the speaker. Mihika is a lecturer in the Department of International Development at the University of Oxford. She works on rural inequalities, land and water conflicts, and the political economy of late industrialization. Her current research is focused on the politics of land dispossession and rural transition in Western India. She has published widely in Journal of Peasant Studies and in a range of other journals. The topic of Mihika's talk today is land rents and accumulation in late industrialization and societies of class in rural India. As I've already said, this is a combined seminar and webinar. The webinar is also live streamed on our YouTube channel, and you can post comments and questions in the live chat at any time. That is, unless you're in the seminar, you have to wait for the question and answer session. You should know also that we're going to record the session. So if you do not wish to be recorded while you're on the webinar, simply don't use your audio or video. And you can find the full program of our webinar and seminar series on our website, Agrarian Questions. With that, let's start today's program. Mihika, over to you for a presentation for the next 15 minutes up to an hour. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jens and Shreya, for inviting me. It's terrific to be here in person at SOAS after many years. So thank you very much. What I'm about to present today is the way I envisage it as a paper, but it is part of a larger research project that looks at land, the politics of land acquisition, and the kind of outcomes that come about in the context that I set as late industrialization, or I conceptualize as late industrialization. And I hope to explain that in the course of this presentation. So the focus of the presentation today is land rents, which is necessarily linked to the fact that land has been pushed towards multiple projects, large infrastructure projects for the last 2 decades. So last 2 decades has witnessed large transformations in connection with large land-hungry projects of infrastructure, industrialization, urbanization, and conservation globally, some of which was linked to earlier debates in 2008 following the spikes in food prices, and was called by a stream of critical scholarship called the global, which saw it as a global land rush. Of course, debates have moved on, and that has been challenged, but also made quite nuanced in terms of its processes and implications. In the Indian context, land has been churned away and turned away for different kinds of infrastructure projects, at least since independence. In India, the state has been diverting land to non-agricultural purposes for dams, industries, and townships for the purposes of nation building. This was right after independence. The last 2 decades has seen the state acquire land for large infrastructure projects such as highways and industrial corridors for urbanization, especially in the form of smart cities, and increasingly green infrastructure such as solar plants. Amassing large tracts of contiguous land in India, where average land holding is about 1.08 hectares, is a complex political task that involves various state institutions. For example, land bureaucracies and the judiciary, but nation and state level laws, the police, as well as various local actors. So, when we are talking about large land for large projects, we are not thinking about land in the hands of landholders, as in the case of Brazil, where we see thousands of hectares of land that classify as plots of land for one landholder. We are talking about small pieces of land in India that have to be aggregated for these large projects. Acquisition of land by the state for such projects has met with opposition, as in the case of a car factory in the eastern state of West Bengal. But an even larger number of projects, the state has managed to generate compliance amongst rural landholders and has managed to get them to sell land by offering compensation packages involving land priced at rates as high as 4 times higher than the market rate, a mix of stealthy changes to land classification, a mix of threat, coercion, and in some cases, violence. So the large number of infrastructure projects and particularly real estate development have spawned, in the case of India, diverse land markets. And studies predict that India will become the 3rd largest construction market by 2025. Announcement of industrial activity and urbanization on such projects heightens expectations of future value of land, increasing demand for rural land in the present moment. So the kind of land markets that emerge often emerge out of these sort of expectations and end up with an immense amount of speculative activities around land. So, for example, urban land prices in India have increased 5 times between 2001 and 2011. In Michael Levine's study, in the case of a special economic zone in Rajasthan, land prices went from $16,000 USD per hectare to $280,000 per hectare within a span of 3 years. So these are the kinds of movements that are taking place in land that lead to these kind of quite spectacular land increases. But what do these land markets then imply for rural landholders who find their land circulating in these markets? Not all who own rural land are able to plug themselves into these burgeoning land markets. It is typically a thin class of landed rural landholders, and nearly always men. So the literature on this has been developing quite rapidly in the last few years on India. It shows various kinds of processes through which rural landholders are incorporated into these land markets. And the literature has tried to theorize the ways in which these markets enable them to pursue different kinds of economic activities. So in the case of India, when we're talking about rich landholders, I primarily mean those who own approximately 4 hectares of land. Within frameworks in agrarian political economy, these men from rural agrarian backgrounds are classified as capitalist farmers, rich peasants, landlords, and famously as the bullock capitalists, as Rudolph's in 1986 called them. Literature from sociology identifies these players as provincial elites, provincial property classes, and dominant rural elites. One of the strands tries to look at how these men from agrarian backgrounds plug themselves into these markets. So Nikita Sood's work shows how men and some women use caste, kin, and employment networks to act as middlemen in land deals. The motivation to enter land markets in this literature, however, is primarily economic. So Michael Levine shows how accumulation through land markets is based on urban links and results in a prosperous neo-rentier class in Rajasthan. Accounts focusing on more proactive and agential activities of these men focuses on how the landlords, so the landholders, the rural landholders participating in markets see themselves as stakeholders and shareholders, as in the case of Sai Balakrishnan's work, who looks at the development of highways in the city of Pune in Maharashtra, which is also the site of my study. Not Pune, but Maharashtra is the site of my study. What is clear and quite lucidly shown in Sai Balakrishnan's work is that in 21st century, location and proximity to urban centers matter more than land fertility in setting land prices. And this is key in producing much of the variation in the dynamics of rural land markets. So what kind of dynamics would one observe in a more rural setting? My empirical case focuses on one such setting. So the study is based in the Western Indian state of Maharashtra. The state is one of the most industrialized, and its capital is Mumbai, the financial capital of India, and home to the spectacular Bollywood. The region I study is located in a rural district in a drought-prone region of the state. The area is, Aurangabad district in the drought-prone region of Marathwada in the northern area. The area is primarily agrarian. As per the 2011 census data, 35% of total workers were identified as cultivators, and another 25% identified as agricultural laborers. So it's a primarily agrarian economy. It is in this context that the Maharashtrian state has been acquiring land for industrialization. But land acquisition in this particular context has been quite gradual. So swathes of agricultural land have been diverted out of agriculture in Aurangabad since 1998. There are two distinct projects for which land has been acquired, or the ones that I look in my study. That land has been acquired in two distinct phases. The first was for planned industrial area, and I will call it the SIA. Around 900 hectares of land was acquired for this SIA industrial area between 1998 and early 2000s. This is the phase one. Three of the villages are part of this study from phase one. The second project is an industrial node within the larger Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor project. So this is a large infrastructure project of which runs across 6 states in India and is voraciously consuming land through these different states. And one segment of that particular project is situated in the location where where my study is based. For this project, in the area that I study, 10,000 hectares of land is being acquired in 3 phases from 44 villages. 2 villages from this phase of land acquisition that is tied to this industrial corridor is also part of my study. Now, these cases are not marked by spiraling land prices and a dizzying churn of land through brokers and the kind of tales of overnight land magnates that we see in some of the other studies. So particularly the studies that are associated with real estate in Gurgaon or the Bangalore city, or even the development of new capital city of Amravati in the southern state in India. Land in the larger rural economy of the region, that is Aurangabad district, is primarily agrarian. The closest city, which is 20 kilometers away, is not a metropolitan city. Rather, its official classification is a semi-urban center. Its location away from a metropolitan city has implications for the dynamism of the local land markets. In the case of the first project in the late 1990s, land acquisition did not engender feverish speculation on the value of land, and therefore did not result in farmers and landholders gaining through land rents at a scale that my interlocutors would identify as a trend. They do not. This is, of course, not to suggest that some in the upper echelons of the ruling political party and their close allies did not make use of information on plans of industrial development to make a profit. It is to suggest that there wasn't the kind of a very fizzy speculative land market at the time. As one landholder told me, back then we did not know so much. We were expecting good jobs for our boys. The compensation amount also seemed good because land rates were low then. there had just been 2 phases of droughts consecutively, and the landholders were hurting, particularly farmers were hurting from 2 successive periods of droughts. Compensation following this 2 droughts in rapid succession seemed adequate, and the expectation was that jobs would come based on successes observed through automobile manufacturing plants in the 1980s in the region. So in the larger social memory of the region in phase 1, there was an expectation that factories would produce jobs. In the second phase, which is this interstate Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor, which started at the end of 2000, this was also at a time when India was witnessing higher growth rates. Expectation based on macroeconomic factors were different. The internet and cell phone had rapidly changed the reach of information, including images and visuals of future projects, and the future projections about what futures could be were shared more freely, which in turn could manufacture expectations in novel ways. It is at this stage that the larger Maratha landholders could expect to make significant gains from land markets. It is important to note, therefore, that the foray into land markets made by the landholders here was relatively gradual, and gains made through land market rents relatively modest as compared to the patterns around Mumbai, Gurgaon, and Bangalore. So I do want to make this distinction because it is also linked to the larger process of learning and the kind of shift away from the expectations of factory jobs that I want to focus on later on in the presentation. So it is in this context that I asked the question, what are the dynamics of local land markets in drought-prone Maharashtra? Who participates in land markets? What combination of economic and social factors enables such participation? And my second main question is, what role do land rents play in the processes of rural differentiation? Now, there are different kinds of rents. So when I say rents, it's quite a broad term. I refer to 2 specific types of land rents. First, rent in land markets is a difference in the value of land when land prices appreciate. So it is a profit above what would be a normal rate of return in a market where information flows, where there's perfect information and information is exchanged freely. This type of rents is the key source of surplus in land markets. The wherewithal of accumulating through rents requires capital, information, and networks. Literature cited here typically engages with this type of rent. In my analysis here, I will also refer to the more classical understanding of rent, which is ground rent, which is surplus value extracted from leasing land that the landholders can earn. And my main argument is that rents from land markets, as well as rents in the more classical sense of ground rents, should be analyzed as a process of accumulation through diversification, but also as an articulation of social difference within the political economic constraints of late industrialization. So going back again to the district, I just want to outline some of the key economic and social features. It is, as I mentioned, it is a drought-prone district. Agrarian crisis is one of the economic realities that the region has to, cultivation and cultivators and farmers have to grapple with. Agriculture is the primary source of income for a majority of households. Farmers in Aurangabad district cultivate a variety of pulses. Tur and gram are the ones that are most common, and vegetables, tomatoes and onions, cotton and corn. In the villages dispossessed by these rolling projects of industrialization, land is largely in the hands of individuals belonging to a single social caste, the Marathas. The Marathas are a middle class grouping of peasant origins and they are Maharashtra's dominant caste cluster. So here dominance refers to a sociological characteristic of which was influentially conceptualized by Srinivas in 1955, which implies that the grouping or the people in this caste are not simply the largest in terms of number, but they also wield preponderant economic and political power. So while the Marathas constitute about 26 to 30% of Maharashtra's population, they own between 35 and 90% of land in the state. This is from Shumit Maskar's recent work in recent paper in 2021. The entwinement of dominance with and through land in the hands of Marathas has manifested in much violence towards Dalits when the latter have demanded land, especially commons for grazing called Gairan land. Not just land, but prominent political positions have disproportionately been concentrated amongst the Maratha caste. So for example, in post-independence Maharashtra, 12 out of the 18 chief ministers of the state have belonged to the Maratha caste. While the Marathas are a dominant caste, not every Maratha farmer is a local powerhouse in rural Maharashtra. There is heterogeneity in the social grouping. In 2011-2012, the wealthiest quintile within the Marathas, so the highest 20%, earned 48% of the total income of the Marathas overall. Significantly, the poorest 40% of Marathas claimed less than 13% of the total income, making them on average fall short of the topmost bracket of the scheduled caste. So the reason why I'm trying to talk about these heterogeneity and the economic inequality within the Marathas is because this inequality within the caste itself has manifested in a politics of what has been characterized as the politics of frustration, vocalized through demands for reservations, but also in income disparities across. So the politics of frustration is Deshpande's term, and the income disparities across Marathas and lower caste, especially Dalits, transpires very often noxiously into the Marathas' ire, which is Teltumbe's term. So resulting in atrocities and violence towards Dalits. So the heterogeneity is key to understanding the kind of politics that the Marathas advance as a caste grouping. Beyond the heterogeneity within the Maratha caste, political dominance of Maratha elites and the trajectories of material accumulation is spatially concentrated in certain parts of the state. Now, this is important because the region that I look at is not one of the regions which saw the Green Revolution touch the areas and did not see the kind of rise of the agrarian dynamism that certain other peasant castes have witnessed in India. So I'm thinking about the Kammas and the Reddys in Andhra Pradesh and the Jats in Haryana. That kind of agrarian dynamism through Green Revolution escaped the Marathas of the Marathwada region. Additionally, they were also excluded from the kind of canal irrigation that enabled a kind of agrarian dynamism in another part of the state, particularly Western Maharashtra. So the kind of the motifs of economic prosperity that is associated with this Maratha caste grouping, like cotton kings and sugar barons, are not the ones that are concentrated in this particular region. And it does not even apply very easily to the top layer caste in Marathwada specifically. And this has, of course, resulted in a kind of a politics, a sub-regional politics of demanding upliftment from backwardness in this particular region. And has made a lot of, the politics has also resulted in active demands for intensified industrialization in the regions. So both the heterogeneity of the economic and social dominance of Marathas across the region, as well as economic differentiation within the caste, are vitally important to understanding the social motivations and the ideological roots of asserting social difference over and above accumulation in this particular region. So in my study across the 5 villages, I identify 4 rural classes. And while the focus of this particular presentation is on the well-off landholders who can be classified as variously as capitalist farmers, but I classify them as dominant class grouping, and I'll explain why. But the average land size of this particular region of landholdings in this district in 2011 was approximately 1.3 hectares. Caste patterns unequal social relations between landholders and the landless. In the study villages, those who own land overwhelmingly belong to the Maratha caste, which is representative of the overall pattern in the state. And the landless disproportionately belong to the Dalit, Mang, and Mahar caste. If the Maratha caste patterns the land laboring divide, size of land holdings is as a key means of production inflects social relations within the caste of Marathas. So in the study villages, therefore, I identify 4 rural classes. To me, class is social relations of production, and I'm following Bernstein's definition here. It is relational, meaning that class can only be identified in relation to another class. Furthermore, social relations are embedded in social identities such as ethnicity, caste, and gender. Formation and reproduction of class, I see as one that is not simply an outcome of shifts in material resources and modes of production, but is also the result of certain social practices that preserve or reshape these class relations. The class of landholders that had about 4 hectares of land or more prior to land acquisition were typically capitalist farmers, and they make up the dominant class, the ones that I identify as the dominant class. They own land and other means of production in agriculture. They hire in laborers and they hire in labor during sowing and harvesting season. The dominant class is overall net buyer of labor. They own technology and agricultural assets like tractors and wells. The dominant class thus were and continue to be engaged in relations of production where they control labor on their farms and extract surplus labor value. Most importantly, the dominance stems from their direct and indirect control of local state institutions, so through caste and kin networks, but also by just being part of those political institutions themselves. Their connections with members of legislative assembly, so with key politicians in the state, village politicians, village institutions, state institutions, as well as their command over the lower classes through such political control. So that is basically the idea of dominance and the dominant class that I work with. The further salience of this class location to me, and part of the reason why I think of them as a dominant class is because this class location becomes quite important in analyzing the processes through which land was acquired and how they negotiated that process, but also the variation in the kind of post-dispossession trajectories that came about. So since my larger interest in the project was looking at the politics of land acquisition, the way the dominant class navigate the process is quite different from the other classes. So just to give you an example, Dattu Damle, name has been changed, of course, who had 4 hectares of land pre-acquisition, said to me, the small farmers maybe are able to buy 1 acre of land in a nearby village. So he's talking about the post-dispossession outcomes. And he said that the small farmers maybe are able to buy 1 acre of land in a nearby village, but that is also tough. The very small ones spend their money, they have expenses to pay for. People like me will be able to stay in agriculture. Damle's pithy summary of small landowners' post-acquisition trajectory holds ground through a more systematic data collection that I've documented elsewhere. What is noteworthy here is Damle's self-identification into a rural class of landowners who retain land for agriculture, either based on initial endowment or by replacing their land holding by new purchases. So people like me, like Damle, that is, make up the dominant class landholders. Before land acquisition, the vast majority relied heavily, if not primarily, on cultivation of tur and cotton using hired-in labor, typically from neighboring villages. Many had at least one male household member who held a job in the town or in one of the local factories or ran a small business. The local elites of this class are typically the past and present village headmen. Those with male members, some are also have family members who are in the police or hold an urban professional job, such as journalist or accountant. And it is this class of men who were expectant of employment in factories and manufacturing plants in the industrial area from phase 1. The importance of factory employment is quite crucial to understanding how they navigate the land market. So after land acquisition, there were primarily, after the first phase of land acquisition, they were primarily expectant of the kind of factory jobs that one expects from formal employment that have permanent contracts, and the ones that allow a kind of social mobility that Jonathan Parry observes in which is encapsulated in the term Naukri, and which is what Jonathan Parry conceptualizes in his case of the Bhilai Steel Township in the state of Chhattisgarh. There are two distinct streams of work that the male members of the dominant class have sought in the past. So one is permanent employment in the manufacturing industry and permanent government jobs. Jonathan Parry, as I said, has shown that a group of local and migrant men incorporate permanent factory jobs as property, as he calls it, as their means of social reproduction and as an extremely significant mode of class formation in the steel manufacturing plants. In the period after liberalization, however, in India, especially in the last 2 decades, factories have not been labor absorptive. In 1960-61, there were about an average of 96 workers per registered factory in the state of Maharashtra. In 2014, the same number had gone down to 67 per registered factory. Meanwhile, labor hiring through contracting has increased. As formal regular employment becomes increasingly elusive, young men have to tread the self-employment route. As of 31st December 2016, of the 36 lakhs individuals who were enrolled in the Life Register of Employment and Self-Employment Guidance Centers in Maharashtra, only 22 lakhs were trained to be employed by factories. What I'm trying to map over here, which I have done in more detail in a paper in Journal of Peasant Studies, is try to look at how the kind of labor landscape that transpires after this first phase not only does it not absorb a thin layer of educated young youth from the dominant class workers into factories, it also curtails severely the opportunity to act as labor intermediaries. So the landscape over here is quite fraught, and it forecloses opportunities to be integrated into the kind of industries that come about. And labor jobs are primarily managed by labor contractors from out of state. And the very high-end jobs on the factory floors are controlled by HR managers through mostly online recruiting portals. So the capacity of manufacturing industries, both in the private and the public sectors, to absorb labor power and emerging aspirations of educated youth have dwindled enormously. This is Bourdieu's broken trajectory effect, which others have also shown, like Craig Jeffrey and Jens and Michael Levine. And it is within this context that the male members of the Maratha caste dominant class households are grappling to to carve out strategies of accumulation, but also social distinction. So the marginalization from factory employment in the industrial area that sits on their land and the foreclosure of properties is what they identify as cheating, rotten deal, and total injustice. The experience of post-dispossession falling short of expectation has been observed in other studies as well, as I mentioned. Proceeds from compensations, therefore, have gone into buying more agricultural land amongst this class. It has also gone into setting up small businesses like fertilizer shops or expanding an existing transport business. Kisan Kale, for example, used to have a buffalo that his wife bought through a loan from a self-help group. With the compensation money, he has expanded his buffalo farm to about 75 buffaloes. Similarly, Nana Sahib set up a transformation business, which his son, who has an engineering degree, runs today. The business has about 10 trucks, according to his own account, but rumors have it that there are a larger number of trucks. And this sort of diversification into small trade, business, services such as water provision, but also labor intermediation to source manual labor to factories and local construction are quite common non-farm activities in this region. This has also been observed by other studies. But what I notice in addition is the kind of class anxiety that it manifests, particularly in this region, as a combination of the fact that not only is it part of the larger political economic landscape of shortage of or broken trajectories in permanent jobs, it is also the case that there is a history of sub-regional politics where the region itself has felt marginalized compared to Western Maharashtra. That becomes important in trying to understand the kind of class anxieties that come about in this amongst the dominant class. So these class anxieties are typically articulated in the form of trying to compare one's own trajectories in this area to Pune. So often in the narratives, farmers would talk about how the kind of aspirations that materialize in the case of Maratha farmers in the Pune has not reached this region, and how it was important for the big men to differentiate themselves from the others who have got similar compensation packages from land acquisition. So the labor market for industrial jobs and landscape of non-farm activities in this regional economy, what I want to suggest, has reified participation in land markets and land rents as a strategy of accumulation and social difference in specific ways for the dominant class. So in this table, I present an investment portfolios of dominant class elites and their transactions with land. Over here, column 4 shows that land acquired by the state for the right after land was acquired by the state, one of the ways in which they used the compensation money was to reinvest in agricultural land. So even within the context of agrarian crisis and the complaints of irrigation projects and state subsidies not reaching this region and going disproportionately towards Western Maharashtra, agricultural land and new land purchases in agriculture continues to be important from the proceeds of the compensation. The scramble to repurchase land was quite pronounced among this class. And that is what I try to get at through this table. Agriculture remains a source of income for this class of landholders. It captures what Damle's narratives above indicates, that people like us will remain in agriculture. Within this group, there are a few who have started to participate in land rents. However, rents from land markets is dependent on surplus from other economic activities, significantly agriculture. So Nana Sahib, for example, one of the one whose portfolio is highlighted in the row 3, he lost about 10 acres of land. And with the compensation money, he purchased 4 hectares of agricultural land in the same village, which is quite a social feat. It is a social feat because not only does it require economic capital, but it also requires a kind of social connections and authority to be able to purchase land within the village, where land in any case has been agricultural land has shifted towards non-agriculture purposes like the industrial area. He also bought 14 hectares of hilly land, which is a vast tract of land from the commons close to the industrial area. And this was through getting the enclosure of this piece of land was done by a change in land classification through his contacts in the land department. So this was made possible primarily through the support and influential politicians and bureaucrats in the local land office. The bending of rule enabled this transaction, and it was in return for Nana Sahib's own services in garnering compliance for the land acquisition process. So it was a give and take relationship in this particular example. He's holding on to this hilly tract of land in the expectation that its price will appreciate when the industrial corridor develops. Similarly, another dominant class farmer, Mule, had diversified out of agriculture even before his approximately 10 hectares of land was acquired for the second phase of the project. While he oversaw agriculture production, he was mostly engaged in working as a journalist in the local area, and also doing petty brokerage, not around land, but just helping service contracts of construction companies in town. Social and political networks, such as the kind that Nana Sahib and Mule have cultivated in Aurangabad town and Mumbai, fuel non-farm commerce for them. In relation to brokering land deals and bridging the social distance between urban and private, urban buyers and private sellers, social distance is Levin's term. What I'm trying to argue that this the use of political networks to play the land market is not just specific to neoliberal India, but it takes a new and augmented form today. So land reforms in the 1950s, for example, had introduced frictions in rural land markets through ceilings and restrictions. It was the rural landed elites, as the kind that I described, Nana Sahib and Mule, who overcame these formal hurdles to retain control over land. So the fact that political connections are important to navigate land has been true since independence, but it takes a specific kind of form in neoliberal India. Rents in land markets and income from brokerage are not steady sources of income. They are volatile and risky. In land markets, demand and supply are contingent on external macroeconomic factors such as liquidity, information on future non-farm uses, but deals also take time to materialize, and they're often not successful in the end. So my first argument is that we need to disaggregate participation into entry into land markets, but also accumulation within markets. The ability to enter land markets is certainly predicated on networks, urban linkages, and social capital as the kind that the literature identifies. But the ability to accumulate through land markets is dependent on the ability to extract surplus through other activities, and in this case, specifically through agriculture. The economic capacity to withstand periods of no income from brokerage or wait it out, as they say, for prices to appreciate requires regular flow of income from other sources. The volatility in the land markets implies that those who participate in them have the ability to withstand periods of low activity. A type of rent holiday is what I want to think of it as. And this is following from Parthasarathy's work on dominant class elites, where he says that one of the reasons why they are able to reproduce their dominance in a class form is because they are able to go on crop holiday. The ability to fall back on income from agriculture production. And so just to clarify that in the context of Parthasarathy's work, crop holiday means that, in instances where lower class agricultural laborers have demanded higher wages, dominant class landholders have the ability to withdraw harvest and withdraw cultivation for a period to be able, because they have the economic capacity to withstand a particular phase of crop holiday. So using that concept, what I am arguing is that the ability to play land markets and to accumulate through rent holiday comes from the ability to fall back on income from agriculture production of dominant class farmers who are able to extract surplus on farm. And this capacity to bargain the land market, to wait it out, is not available to every class of landholder. A second argument is based on the following observation that a number of elite dominant class men prefer participating in land markets over other forms of equally lucrative sources of income, such as labor intermediation. This preference, I'd like to suggest, is not just material, but also social. So Bhalerao Kakre is a young Maratha man in his early 20s. Given that the income of the broker is based on commission earned from a successful deal, it is not possible for petty brokers. Just to clarify that, given that the income of a land broker is based on commission earned from a successful land deal, it is not possible for petty brokers like Kakre to rely solely on from intermediation in land. But Kakre's story goes back to his journey from being not starting off as a land broker, but after the sale of about 9 hectares of land that belonged to his household, he first started his business by setting up a shop on a land that the household bought from the compensation money on a plot of land close to the highway. The idea was very much to use that land to set up a commercial enterprise. He started by setting up a shop there, which failed as a business enterprise. Bhalerao Kakre then started to work as a labor broker or labor intermediary, supplying manual laborers to the industrial area. He called his particular enterprise of labor intermediation Divine Power, and I've changed the name, but it is to indicate the kind of reference that he was making to a particular Hindu god. Divine Power supplies workers who are employed on monthly contracts. At the time of my field work, he had supplied workers earning monthly contract, about 140 workers to companies on contracts at Power and Infrastructure Private Limited, which is it's a Maharashtra-based company that sits on about 9 hectares of land which is very close to the land that he owned as during his family. Some of these workers, so he has about 140 who work as workers under his intermediary firm. Some of these workers earn as much as 45,000 Indian rupees, so about 500 pounds a month. But these are few and far between. So out of his about 140 workers who flow through his brokerage firm is what he likes to call it, about 2 or 3 would categorize as those who are on contract, primarily as they work as guards in factories, or as electricians who are on contracts mediated by this particular firm. But for this guaranteed income, he collects about a fee of about 2,000 to 3,000 Indian rupees. So even if I do a crude calculation, a conservative estimate of the kind of income that Bhale Rao earned, it was about close to 2,300 GBP a year on a very good year. This is more than what he earns as a labor intermediary today. So when I first met him in 2016, he was working as a labor intermediary. By the time I went in 2018, he had decided to close his, he had decided to stop working as a labor intermediary and started dealing in land. But primarily he bought a piece of land close to the industrial area to set up a restaurant and to extract ground rents from other small properties that his household owned. Just to highlight basically that the kind of preference that he made, the kind of switch he made from going from a labor mediary to a land was quite usefully is encapsulated in this quote. He fought very hard to get a small plot of land close to the industrial area. He said, I had to fight for it. I had to make applications, talk to people, make them understand, and basically negotiate. It took a lot of time. Getting MIDC on board and getting license for liquor from the excise department was not easy. But I did not want to continue as a labor intermediary. It was too much of a tension job. As I have up here on the quote, he says that, he had to deal with people. He did not like dealing with the police or fight and to deal with the supervisors regularly. What he does, what the particular set of or the portfolio of work that he does as a petty broker, but also as someone who is able to get rents from the restaurant and offering some of his houses to migrant workers, is that it is a no hassle job. It is relaxed. And even I don't even have to go every day. It is a no tension work. These are the kind of narratives that I heard from another labor broker who moved into land brokerage following his 2 years of services to this particular industrial area, where he worked as, again, a Maratha dominant class man who was from a neighboring village and supplied laborers to this particular area. What emerges from some of these narratives is that rents from land markets or ground rents cannot be read purely through the material logic alone. The preference for participating in land markets, it's not simply economic profit, but the ability to articulate a kind of social difference, not just from the laboring classes, but from those within the dominant class who do not have the economic and social means to participate in the land markets. This articulation is based primarily on their practices at work. So they perform the kind of work that the men see fitting of elites within the dominant class. The preference for this type of work is based on caste-based norms of labor. So here, the caste-based elite norms of labor is one that is seen as an antithesis of manual labor. So elite Maratha men who do not want to perform manual labor see toil as not valorized, as it is the case in the work that Sharad has produced in his book Fraternal Capitalism, or the kind that he sees over there. It is one that has nothing to do with manual labor. It is also about being able to control one's own time. So one of the norms that the Kakare is articulating is a rejection of subordination when interacting with the supervisors of the factory sites, but also in dealing with the kind of state institutions where he has to encounter the police and where he feels watched by or humiliated in front of other Maratha caste men who work for them. It is also about having a serious negative preference, to use Vinay Gidwani's term, to be subordinate, as I just said, subordinated at the site of work, including the kind of skirmishes that challenge the authority in front of other Marathas, as is the case for Kakre above. Preference for not having to negotiate with and supplicate before state authorities is key to understanding the kind of legitimation that Kakre is talking about through his work portfolio. And it is a legitimation of being a dominant class landholder. The other kind of norms that comes about, so when in one of the key practices of work amongst these dominant class farmers who have become brokers, who are dealing with lands and are moving towards transport services, is to have an office, is to share visiting cards. So some of these practices are the ones that that would have emerged for these upwardly mobile dominant class men had they moved into the kind of jobs that they preferred. But these practices of managerial work are the ones that they are trying to recreate within their work as brokers of land deals. It's also the kind of practices that Sejuti Dasgupta observes amongst her nouveau riche farmers today in other parts of India. These norms and practices of work, I am suggesting that they enable, over and above the risk-bearing ability and social capital, it enables them to articulate social difference within the larger dominant class. It is about marking a boundary, very similar to what Carol Upadhyay observes in the kind of class formation that she sees in the upwardly mobile, urban-oriented landholders and dominant elites in the state of Andhra Pradesh in the 1990s. And it is akin to the kind of Pierre Bourdieu's concept of social distinction that Michael Levine observes amongst the neo-rentier class in his work in Rajasthan, although he does not talk about the social practices of work. So just to conclude my main argument, by thinking through how the participation in land markets, particularly the ability to accumulate, is part of a larger portfolio of extracting rent and surplus from other activities, as well as this idea that preference for participating in land rents is not simply one of accumulation, but also one of a social preference, is not to suggest that it is some sort of a totalizing account of how class is how differentiation takes place. It is linked very much to a very specific kind of trajectory of rural land markets in this particular context. It is linked to the kind of larger political, economic, labor landscape within neoliberal India. And it is a kind of, it speaks to a kind of class anxiety that is particular to this group of dominant class of Maratha group of landholders in this particular region. The implication over here is that in this particular phase of late industrialization, where labor landscape is quite fraught and precarious for many of these landholders, so not just the dominant class, land commodification has been reified as a particular mode of articulating social difference within class. It undergoes a process of differentiation within the dominant caste of Maratha. So, it reproduces the kind of, it is predicated on inequality, the kind of economic inequality that I started out with by showing that, there is heterogeneity within this particular caste, but also reproduces that particular inter-caste inequality. The fact that there is, that the markets are volatile and the strategies of accumulation have been is accumulated through a process of land markets and labor brokerage is one that that is quite, it is an attempt to mark social difference, but one that creates a lot of social conflict in the region, and that manifests often into vast, into violence and a kind of caste mobilization against particularly Dalits in this particular area. And last, I want to suggest that speculation as a strategy of accumulation has intensified commodification of land in general, of course, but also increasingly accumulation is seen as one that can only be generated out of extraction of other scarce resources, such as water. In some ways, which reproduces the kind of, or it generates a kind of social contradiction that Shreya Sinha and other co-authors have observed in their work on land degradation. So, a kind of inequality that is being reproduced on the basis of extraction of land, water, and other ecological resources.
Thank you very much. And we will now, maybe you can just stop sharing. So,
yeah.
Thanks so much for this presentation. Of course, extremely rich, and because it's rich, there are also questions here that begs themselves, I think, and I hope we can have a great question and answer session. For those in the room here, it's fairly straightforward how to do that. For those on the webinar, they can both raise their hand there, and they can also write in the chat, and so can those on YouTube, and Shreya will monitor those, I hope, and so we can have the questions from there. If I should just start off with a couple of comments and questions to kick this part of the session off, then I thought of, so well, firstly, so this is it was interesting how, in relation to Michael Levian's work on dispossession without development under neoliberalism, where he has a strong argument about how dispossession has always happened, but now it doesn't even create economic development. So it's only speculation. So you're arguing that in this case, it does create, in a sense, development. There is industrial development. There might not be good jobs and so on, but there's some sort of development. So that in itself is an interesting conclusion. And now, looking at what does this mean for the dominant class and for their relation to land, then it was also very interesting that that they invest in land. But if I understood you correctly, it is mainly in land as land is given value in relation to the new industrial activities, because they service that through restaurants and through activities on the land. That was the examples you used. Do they also invest in land simply as agricultural land, while they so has this process also led to a reinvigoration of classic agrarian capitalism, or is it land now seen in relation to an industrial development that it is given value, which is Levian's argument as well, that land now has value in relation to not agriculture, but something else. So that is, in a sense, my one question. Maybe you explained it, maybe I just didn't quite get it, but I thought that would be important to figure out, because that is the transition, whether we then like that kind of transition. If land now is valorized in relation to an industrial development, it has changed character, hasn't it?
Yeah.
So, and my second question is regarding class anxiety. I thought it's a wonderful concept, but I not. It would be interesting to hear a bit more about it. So the dominant class suffer from class anxiety because they are not the same as the Maratha farmers in the Pune region, but so they're not doing as well as some brethren they are comparing themselves to. But are they also, is their accumulation also tenuous? I mean, Shreya Sinha has argued in Punjab that even the big capitalist farmers, in a sense, while they certainly are accumulating, it is also under tenuous conditions, they're indebted and so on. So is that also what you wish to signal by the concept, or is it anxiety in relation to it is harder to be a Maratha capitalist in this area than another area only? So those are my two the questions to kick off the discussion.
Okay. Thanks, Jens.
Sorry, if I can just interrupt. Can Mihika move a little bit, because you're getting covered by the screen, by the desktop. So if you move to...
Should I stand?
No, if you just move towards the ends a bit, I think it should...
Go here, I go here.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that might be better. Yeah, okay, sorry.
Yeah, so your first question on reinvigoration of agriculture. So what I was trying to show from that elaborate table that I had was that amongst the dominant class landholders, one of the ways in which the proceeds of the compensation is used is by making sure that at least the amount of land that they lost on agriculture is replaced by agricultural land. Most of the time, it is not land within the village, because land prices in the village have appreciated, and also agricultural land that remains in the village has a social landscape through which it is, controlled in terms of, how it's distributed. Often it is in a neighboring village or further away. The way in which they engage on this land in terms of their labor arrangement is through sharecropping. So most of these landholders are now engaged in sharecropping on a 50-50 basis, on which they primarily grow vegetables. Increasingly, the kind of agriculture, so very often the landholders would argue that when they purchase agricultural land, increasingly they want to move towards horticulture and the production of foods. So the kind of agricultural crops that allow them to enter the cash crop economy more than cultivating pulses, cotton, and the more traditional crops of the region. So in terms of whether it results in a reinvigoration of agriculture in the district that is stricken by agrarian crisis, I mean, on balance, the economy continues to, the rural economy continues to be driven by agricultural income. One of the primary sources of income continues to be agriculture. It's just that I think that in terms of who participates in agriculture and the kind of, there has been further differentiation in terms of who continues to be in agriculture and who does not. In terms, there seems to be a change, particularly in the villages closer to town, to move away from cotton and pulses and increasingly towards cash crops amongst the kind of dominant class elites who have been able to reinvest money into agricultural land. I don't think I have the data to say whether systematically overall it leads to a reinvigoration of agriculture, but there's certainly a change in the kind of agricultural production and the kind of labor arrangements that a change is emerging in the kind of crops that are grown, as well as the labor arrangements around which, on the terms of which agriculture is taking place. In terms of your question on local, on the articulation of or class anxiety, I'm talking about some of the factors that you have spoken and more. So it is a kind of, it is a particular articulation of feeling, of a feeling that accumulation is taking place on tenuous basis, as you said, that Shreya's what she finds in her particular context in Punjab. It is also the kind of, it is also an anxiousness, or it is an anxiety that comes from the idea that social dominance does not take place in the kind of overt control of labor even Jonathan Pattenden finds this in his case of labor intermediation. So increasingly, domination is not about overt and explicit control over labor. So with accumulation becoming more tenuous, and with social dominance and the kind of frictions that come about from this process of land acquisition, including the the fragmentation of solidarity across of class solidarity across the Maratha men, but also the frictions that come from certain Maratha men accumulating disproportionately than others. The kind of social frictions that come about has led to a sense that authority is diminishing, accumulation is becoming more precarious, and dominance overall is loosening. So it is a sort of a local idea of a dissipation of dominance, but it is also in relation to the fact that accumulation trajectories in this particular region was marginalized compared to other parts of Maharashtra, and that it is one of those regions that was neglected, had seen state neglect, and did not see the kind of agrarian dynamism that we see in other parts of Maharashtra. So it is regional, but it is in relation to other regions, but it's also local.
Thanks. Now the floor is open. We have a question from down there, and we do have an issue here that because we can only hear it on the microphone up here. But let me try and repeat your question when you have put it.
First of all, thank you. Just fascinating and granular detail, which is great. I'm curious, sort of following on Jens's question, you've given us a picture of precarity and transformation at the top strata of the caste class hierarchy, but you've also told us that only some of the Maratha fellows can achieve this kind of new accumulation strategy. What's happening to the middle and lower classes getting squeezed out? You talked about previous regimes of accumulation based on labor management, and now those are fading, and these fellows are saying we don't want to work in that stressful managerial role. We'd rather work in land brokerage. So what happens to the landless laborers in this? And are more Maratha men becoming landless laborers? Are we seeing a concomitant transition to proletarianism or pauperization or immiserate? Tell us more about what happens then to labor when only some people can continue a sort of rentier strategy.
So I don't know if the question could be heard online, but
yeah,
if not,
it became quite clear.
Good, excellent. Yeah. Well, let us take the questions one by one. So please.
Okay. So I'll start with the landless and the ones who have been proletarianized. So that is what I have described in one of the papers where I look at I've mapped the kind of post-dispossession trajectories that come for this particular group. Now, most of them belong to, as I said, the landless mostly belong to the Mang and the Mahar caste. They were landless, so they did not work on agriculture. They did not work in agriculture, and they preferred to not work as agricultural laborers as part of caste mobilization even before the industries arrived. So they were involved in construction work and other forms of manual labor in city even before the industries arrived. Once the industries arrived, it is this class of laborers, the landless, as well as those who had marginal land holdings belonging to various castes, but also Maratha castes, who have been made landless from this process. They are the ones who move into providing labor as manual labor within these factories. And in terms of how they are managed, controlled, and access work is one that is that I've described in this particular paper to show that it is one that is controlled by labor intermediaries, some that are from the village, but most that are outside the village. Here I also find a gendered story where a lot of women from the Dhangar community in that particular area also who did not have land were able to move into these sort of precarious casual manual work. for them, precariousness has not changed. So, one of the things that I try to show over there is that precarity for them on farm and off farm has remained constant. This particular, what happens to labor amongst the manual labor that is there that exists on industrial areas is the story of fragmentation. And I try to show what the implications are for the politics of such labor in that particular region, which is to show that it is not one class at all. It is fragmented along the lines of gender and caste because of how they access the labor markets. In terms of the other groups of the middle, sort of the middle peasants, as I've called them in my classification, they are the ones who are resolutely trying to stay on to agriculture on the terms that they previously were. So they're the ones who have, most of them now have smaller land holdings than they previously had. They continue to depend now more heavily on wage work outside of their farms. And it is very much the kind of, there's variation in the way that an analytic frame of classes of labor would be able to best encapsulate in trying to understand the different ways in which they are reproducing, but in the different ways in which they're also therefore articulating the politics, which is mostly on the lines of caste, because there is more variation in the caste groupings of the middle peasants.
Thank you. Yes, please. Could you speak up a bit? That would be fantastic.
I was wondering what the connection is with larger circuits like capital circuits that extend to larger cities, not just this industrial corridor, but say Mumbai, or is there any connection to that? And also in terms of the people who stay, in case the people can't afford to stay accumulate through agriculture, do they migrate to cities as youth labor or as people who don't have a basis anymore?
Could that be heard?
No, can you repeat that?
So the question was, what are the wider connections of both labor and capital to the wider region, Mumbai, etc. So how is this region integrated into that, and what impact does that have on local class relations?
It was so in terms of migration, it was quite striking to me that some of the dominant class men, the ones I classify as dominant class, they quite strikingly said how men from their households do not migrate because they are local and they're someone in the region, and therefore they want to continue to be in the region. So that is one way of trying to sort of articulate that there isn't that many linkages between the more sort of the kind of non-farm employment that one would find in Mumbai or Pune or Nashik, etc. So the big cities in the region. I think in terms of, I do not have very systematic evidence of what precise linkages are, but there are. What I find is that the most of the businesses and the kind of that they engage in, the non-farm enterprises of transport, but also providing other kinds of services, have links to the town close to the region. There has to be migration, and it is one of those. I think that is more of an exception than a norm. So I do not have a very clear migration story and linkages between Mumbai and some of the other bigger cities in Maharashtra in this particular context. Marathwada and Vidarbha, in that sense, they see migration, but they see migration mostly of agricultural laborers who move to migrate to Western Maharashtra to work on sugarcane farms. So that is the migration linkages that usually comes up in trying to think about labor across Marathwada and Vidarbha. In this particular villages, it was not something that was quite prominent, but also I did not proactively, sort of seek it out.
Mm-hmm. Fine, thanks. Yes,
This was the question where you put the farmers detail how much land they buy and sell. And so, Jalna came out as one of the major locations where they bought the land. And you described what type of land they would buy, like commons and stuff. But what about Jalna then? Because Jalna, compared to Aurangabad, still comes like in the underdeveloped districts of Maharashtra. So what type of land did they buy there? And then obviously then it changes the dynamics in the district, that district too.
Okay, so it is very clear to me that table was not at all clear, but my whole point was that that entire table was to show that land was all agricultural land that was repurchased. So all of the land that I showed as repurchased land was all agricultural land. And one of the reasons why Jalna came up as a popular site where more agricultural land was purchased is because of family ties and kin networks. So very often there are, whether it is through marriages or just through location, there are links between the villages and Jalna, which is a town close to those villages, and very often landholders reinvested in land and purchased agricultural land in villages where they had some family living, because the sharecropping arrangement then was materialized primarily because of links, family links and kinship links across these villages. So that is the reason why Jalna is a popular site.
Okay, thank you. I think we should just go to Shreya now, because I think you have questions from the chat and maybe also some yourself. And before I do that, let me just point out that both here and on the webinar, there are people that work in Maharashtra, do research in Maharashtra. So of course, comments and questions from them would be very welcome as well. And I know that we will get one from here in a minute. But Shreya, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Jens. So we have a question from Vikas Dubey, who's saying, what are the implications of compensation for caste solidarity within the dominant class? So that's the question, the big question. And then I have a couple of questions of my own. Thanks so much for such an interesting and rich presentation. So I think one of the questions I have is in relation to the kind of discussion you had on the relation between land rent and agriculture. And I think, unless I've misunderstood it, I think the point you were making was that people use surplus from agriculture to kind of get more land rent. So it's kind of a sort of a loop in which this works. I'm not sure if that was right, but it feels like it was kind of flowing in the opposite direction, like the ability to, hold, to do agriculture was also helping them in therefore getting land rents. That's how I understood it, but I could be wrong. So the question therefore is that given that this is sort of a drought-prone area already marginalized, of course, there must be an agrarian crisis. This is, there are kind of issues around volatile prices or indebtedness or whatever. So I mean, how viable is this relationship? How can people sustain, to what extent can you really rely on agricultural surplus to sustain sort of land rent? I think that's the one question. The other thing is actually, I'm just sort of interested in hearing more of your thoughts on sort of the framing of late industrialization, which is that, of course, I mean, of course, in this particular case, you do describe, the industries are coming up in this particularly sort of marginalized region. But of course, late industrialization, is a concept that came up in different historical contexts. And it referred also to contexts where there was, very serious industrialization, but India's political economy doesn't have that kind of industrialization, that sort of employment generation. And I just wanted to hear sort of your reflections on using that sort of framing for your case. There's another question on the chat, but I mean, I can wait and we can come back to it. Yes, yeah. Thanks.
Okay, so I think I'll start with Shreya's questions. So Shreya, I suppose I was not very clear about what I meant in my first argument in terms of links between land markets and the surplus from agriculture. But the point that I was trying to make is that the fact that accumulation within land markets happens through rents, and to the ability to generate that rent requires a kind of a waiting period for land prices to appreciate. It also requires failed deals, or deals that don't entirely fully materialize in the end. So this ability to withstand these periods of low income or no income comes from the fact that particularly the elite dominant class men have a portfolio of other economic activities, of which agriculture is a part. Now, for this narrow group of men, agriculture is a surplus generating activity because they have large agriculture tracts and they have augmented what land they lost by either replacing the entire amount or at least partially and are now cultivating through sharecropping arrangements. Some of them want to diversify into horticulture. So for them, agriculture, for a small section, is a surplus generating activity, or at least it's a source of income that allows them to withstand these fluctuations in land markets. And that is primarily the reason, and what I'm suggesting is that that is the reason why not only can they enter the land market, but they can sustain a possibility of accumulation within land markets, where land markets are quite volatile, particularly in this region, which is not close to Bangalore or Gurgaon, that sees a lot of churn of land and a lot of activity in land markets. And this has not particularly become true after COVID. So some of my research participants that I'm in touch with talk about how land markets have sort of have gone thunder or cold, as they say it. So so it is a drought-prone region. It is agrarian crisis is intense and debilitating in this particular region. Droughts have occurred multiple times. So it is not that agriculture is surplus generating for the largest section of those who are in cultivation. It is that the dominant class elites are able to generate surplus, and that is key to their ability to be able to generate rents in land markets. Your second question about, I hope that was clear. I keep looking here thinking that in terms of your second question about land industrialization, the reason why I think of the kind of dynamics of industrialization that I observe in the region and I conceptualize it as late industrialization, because it comes from, I wanted to intervene in those debates that looked at, so what Michael Levine calls the more developmental regime of India's development. So while Ron Herring and all have called India a failed developmental state, but we had that period where industrialization was relatively labor absorptive, and that's what Michael Levine calls a developmental regime of dispossession. When I first went into this area, I wanted to sort of, in Bengal, when the nano factory did not, when the state was not able to push through the nano factory, and there was a debate about whether the factory should have materialized in the state of West Bengal. So this is a car factory that was meant to come in eastern state of West Bengal. It had, the Communist Party was in power at the time. Farmers resisted, and the factories, there was immense violence against the farmers, and the factory did not come about in the end. There was a debate about how large sections of policymakers, activists, and politicians, as well as some large farmers, argued that the factory should have come, because factories can generate jobs, and there are linkages, and there are positive externalities, and that sort of develops a kind of a developmental outcome. So I wanted to study a case where it was not one where a special economic zone was announced but never materialized, or it was not a kind of a zone that Michael Levine studies, where it is one that has gone to the highly skilled IT enable service sector. It is not one about city development. I wanted to study an industrial area. And the way I see the late industrialization, the political economy of late industrialization materializes that it cannot be clearly mapped onto a kind of a neoliberal regime of accumulation by dispossession, in the sense that it is not simply speculation. It is a manufacturing hub where actually factories and plants materialize. There are practices of planning that are invoked in this process of land acquisition, but also in terms of how domestic capital is attracted to the area. There are institutions, the state institutions that resonate more with the previous regime of state industry negotiations rather than the current neoliberal form of just providing plain incentives. So it is this particular characteristic, the set of characteristics that I observe in the planning and the politics of developing this industrial area that I classify as late industrialization, with the intention of trying to mark what is specific to this particular era and what labor possibilities can actually emerge when manufacturing does arrive in an area. So, and of course that is grim, but I still wanted to study what kind of labor outcomes are possible when manufacturing plants, less labor absorptive and more capital intensive labor manufacturing plants materialize on agricultural land. So that is my concept of late industrialization. The other question, which is the tough question on implications of caste solidarity within the class. I think, so one of the ways I think about within the dominant class, the kind of the increase in inequality and the differentiation that comes from these land markets within the dominant class, I think fragments caste solidarity. And one of the ways in which we are seeing that is it manifests in how they have repeatedly intervened or not intervened in farmer protests, or they have not intervened in the kind of mobilization that has taken place within Maharashtra more locally around issues of the water crisis or the agrarian crisis. So there is a kind of a fragmentation, there's a caste fragmentation within this dominant class, which increasingly is beginning to define the politics of that region amongst the Maratha castes.
Interesting. So we now have both a question from the webinar and one from here. We start with the one here, Suraj.
Yeah, thanks. It was really intense.
So please speak up.
Oh, okay. So I was wondering, I wanted to see the chart. Can you put on the slide?
We probably have packed it down.
It's down there.
Yeah, down there. There.
Yeah, that. The table one.
Can you share it, Jens, so that we can also.
That would probably help too. Yes.
Yeah, we can also.
Where have we got that? This one. I'm not used to. I've got a Mac myself, so that. How do we do that? So let's share. Yes, but meanwhile, can you put the question nevertheless?
Ask the question, yeah.
So I was wondering, when the land is being sort of purchase new land after once they lose the old land. So how do you sort of verify the numbers that they give you? I mean, did you go look for the compensation policies that government was publishing? That's one. Because if you see the compensation received and land purchase, if it is an agricultural land, then the compensation is quite high, even from that average local land rates. And I mean, was it exaggerated by the respondent themselves? And many times these are very sensitive and people don't really say what they will get.
So it's a question about the compensation received, whether this is the actual compensation or whether there is a question of how it's reported, whether it is properly reported, or if it is sort of people's own ideas that has not been verified otherwise.
So is that your question?
That's one.
Okay.
And the second one was about, you mentioned about this ethnographic method. How did you do it and what was it? Because you talked about the
So when you're saying it was an ethnographic method, what does that mean? Thanks.
Okay, so the land the column on the fourth column is the new land they have purchased, and they all have different rates at which they have purchased. So the sixth column is the total amount that they have. So the rate at which they purchase the different land. So so there are different rates based on whether the land was bought in Jalna and or wherever else they're bought. These are all self-reported, so I do not have ways to confirm whether that is the price that they paid. But what I do, what I can confirm from just official documents, but also because of the fact that when compensation prices are set, so when the last two columns, compensation received, is the total of the compensation money that they received based on the amount of land that they had. And some of them were able to also negotiate a lump sum compensation for standing fruit crops. So particularly the ones that had sweet lime or a well if they had. So these were individual negotiations. So the total compensation amount is in the second last column. And the last column then shows the amount that they spent on buying new land, which is self-reported. So what I'm quite sure about is the overall figures. The rate at which they bought this new land, I have no way of confirming that, because that is self-reported, and that's what the table shows. But what I was quite what to me is quite insightful is the fact that there are certain, and these are they're the ones who, so Nana Sahib, for example, they're the ones who have been previously panchayat members, or the most influential elites. They're the ones who were able to spend more on purchasing, on buying or increasing their land portfolio compared to, over and above the compensation money. So while a large section of the Maratha landholders, while they are able to only restrict their new purchases based on compensation amount, the ones that are, and this is the reason why I say that they're surplus generating in their other economic activities, is because they are able to purchase beyond the compensation, the total compensation amount that they receive. So that's that. Hopefully that clarifies some of the figures on that particular table. In terms of ethnographic methods that I put, my methods most involved. So I spent 1 year first in Aurangabad town, but also sometimes living in villages with some key research participants, and the rest of it. And then I had several short visits for 2 weeks where I would often live in the villages itself. So my methods are mostly based on interviews, both semi-structured and open-ended interviews, short surveys as well as looking at planning documents, doing interviews at the different state bureaucracies, including some that were in Mumbai, and talking to various stakeholders, going to industrial events by the parastatal organization that was organized, sitting in on those instances where there were small groups of farmers that were resisting after being aligned with certain local activist groups, sitting in on their meetings. So that's what I mean when I say ethnographic methods. mostly based on participation. But if you are, if you are an anthropologist and if you're asking me if I did an ethnography, no, I did not. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, Shapan. I think you're still mute, Shapan.
Okay,
Yeah.
can I be heard now?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I have a question about the pattern of repurchasing of land by those who have received compensation. It seems that what we have here is a situation where people are buying land and then giving it to sharecroppers for sharecropping. It's not obviously not resumption, but it is also not ground rent from capitalist tenants. So in effect, what you have is buying land for extraction of pre-capitalist ground rent through sharecropping. Now, my question is, given all the changes that we have heard about in this region in terms of industrialization, the impact of neoliberal policy regimes, and indeed some degree of urbanization, why is it that we find this classic pattern of accumulation of land and extraction of ground rent, pre-capitalist ground rent? Why, why is this kind of classic pattern prevailing here, and what is the significance of this?
A small question for you there. Thanks, Shapan.
So classical ground rent, I can see instantly, and thank you for that question. Obviously, now I'm going to have to think about that. So Professor Nan, I think that I understand why it is classic ground rent, and you're talking about that pattern, but pre-capitalist, I am not sure how to address that component of your question at this moment. I think the sharecropping arrangement is because I think so one of the trends that I observe in this particular region, and I mean, and that does not require this study. I mean, given the vast amounts of agricultural land that have gone into land acquisition, the amount of land that is classified as agricultural land in this particular region has dwindled. So by necessity, the largest amount, the largest number of landholders who want to continue to have agricultural land will move into areas outside. And this particular fact necessitates that arrangements are based on, so I mean, the arrangements are based, so they maintain their locality very much within the village, because villages themselves have not been acquired. It is only farmland adjacent to their, homesteads and their gauthans that have been acquired. So I think that arrangement necessitates that sharecropping is the mode through which they can operate cultivation, and so I think the answer is that I cannot clearly tell you why this pre-capitalist ground rent pattern one observes. Perhaps you can help me. And in terms of its significance in relation to land rents, it's primarily this. I think that this particular area, because non-farm activities, agriculture is in distress because of agrarian crisis, but at the same time, it is not one that has observed an extremely vibrant non-farm economy. So it is always in combination of agriculture and non-farm activities that the particular class of dominant holders can the dominant class landholders can accumulate. And that requires them to have, that requires them to, continue with agriculture. And since their own land holdings, agricultural land holdings in their village is dwindled, it is only through sharecropping arrangement, I think, that they can continue. And its significance for me is most relevant to the fact that this ability is the one that allows them to generate rents in the other way in the speculative land markets. But
Can I
don't have a very good answer for that.
Can I just come back on that?
Yeah.
Yes, one point that you mentioned was a shift in the crop mix. So cotton and other things to vegetables, which were cash crops for the urban market. Now, is the crop share which is obtained in these cases, is it in terms of these vegetables and so on? I mean, is it
So
I think we lost Shapan.
Yes. While we're waiting for Shapan to come back, we are about to close soon, but there are a couple of questions and comments in the chat, and we have a question here. So let's just take the questions, and then Mihika, you will have the last comments, as much time as there's left. Question, please.
Just a quick question. So considering that there's acquisition of contiguous land, and most of it is held by dominant classes, and they end up negotiating for a very high price, almost 4x of what is offered initially, right? So does that mean that does this benefit spill over to smallholders who have land attached to those? So in a sense, that's a positive spillover. Does that happen?
yes, yes. So you
Can we just take the two others, because then you can wrap up in the end? Sorry, Shreya, would you mind doing the honors?
I'm just going to summarize these really quickly in the interest of time. So one of the questions from Bhupendra Kumar is, you're thinking of, how do you see the Maratha agitation for reservation when they are successful in accumulation through rents? And basically, why do you call it class anxieties? Shouldn't it be caste anxieties? So that's, there's a question on industrial labor, but I think you answered that, so I'll let that be. Shruti has asked about, was land acquisition a criteria for selecting the villages you did? And how did you define industrial area? Is it just the presence of the Maharashtra Industrial Development Corporation? And just to be fair to Surendra, his question was, what do you think about industrial labor who have lost their small agricultural land? I think that's covered, but anyway, yeah, so these were the questions.
Sorry, what was the first question again? I got stuck on the class versus caste anxiety.
The first question was just your reservations, your view on the,
caste anxiety and not. So in a couple of minutes, we really ought to stop by 7. So if there are others that need the room. So in a couple of minutes, if you want to touch on these questions, or some of them at least.
Okay. So the quick answer to your question is that, yes, compensation rates are set for, for villages, for the phase itself. So whatever villages get acquired, the compensation is set as such. 4 times the market price is now legislated by the act itself, but earlier Maharashtra claims that it was one of those states that allowed this sort of a developmental outcome, as policymakers would like to call it in Maharashtra. That the fact that they were offered a price higher than the market rate is the reason why Maharashtra is so industrialized, and because generating compliance has been so easy. In terms of reservations, I mean, I see the mobilization and the participation of landholders and Maratha, the dominant class, in demands on claims for reservation is certainly a caste anxiety, but it uses the idiom of caste. But in terms of trying to, in terms of the kind of jobs and the kind of jobs, particularly in jobs, the kind of the jobs that they are demanding reservations for, that itself is segregated and in terms of, within the caste who can access it. So there is the most vocal voices within, at least locally, within the reservation mobilization around jobs are the dominant class elites, because they are the ones who have their sons and very rarely daughters who go into ITI training or the kind of engineering degrees through which they can get permanent jobs in the public sector. In terms of getting reservation in the education institution, yes, the demands open up, they multiply, and it sort of it takes an umbrella of the entire caste. I still want to stick to my term of class anxiety, because I see that as quite critical to understanding what is happening in terms of the economic activities in the local area. And therefore, I'm saying that it is a local articulation of class, one that does not involve a very generalized and universal claims to what dominant class is in India, but it is a local articulation. It is contingent in some ways to the time and this outcomes of late industrialization.
And I think we have to stop there. Sorry. Before we stop, sorry to you, Shapantu. It was a pity we lost you in the middle of it, but we have to draw it to a close. Of course, the very issue about sharecropping is becoming more and more important in India, as sharecropping is actually increasing. Yeah. So it is something that is certainly worth considering, but not here now, alas. With this, I will thank everyone on the webinar, the participants in the seminar, and of course, first and foremost, the speaker. Thanks, Mihika, and thanks to the team that made this possible. Thank you. And with that, we end. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Hi, Steve.